These are the Surface LDT Insane calf sleeves. We tested 5 riders on these sleeves and every single one of them was more AERO. 4 out of the 5, however, were actually faster in another brand. Welcome to Faster Fiction. Hey everybody, Jim from AERO Sports here. Thank you for tuning in to the calf sleeve edition of Faster Fiction, at least the first of what I'm sure will be many. Okay, so we needed to answer 2 questions here. First of all, do calf sleeves even work? Do they even make you more aerodynamic? We had to answer that question first and foremost. Second, we were interested to see if one brand perhaps stood out from another. But to be honest with you, a lot of these brands are sort of very similar. In fact, they all kind of use the same ribbed fabric. Not all of them, but many of them. And so their designs are quite the same. So while we initially started out with 2 brands, that eventually molded into 3 brands and then back down to 2 brands. And so, but the brands changed. So we're going to go over the data here and show you what we found. It was quite fascinating and quite surprising in the end, which brand sort of stood out from all the rest. Okay, so all in all, we tested 7 athletes. However, only 2 of them actually tested 3 different calf sleeves, and those calf sleeves ended up being Rule 28, Surface, and then Zoot. Only 2 riders tested all 3 because one of those brands sort of got pushed aside right away, and that was Rule 28. And we'll talk about that later, but really it just started to then come down to Zoot and Surface. Surface, we just had the size medium because quite honestly, I wasn't going to spend $500 on this test buying products, especially calf sleeves. So we had 4 athletes, or really 5 athletes, test Zoot versus Surface. And then we had other athletes test just Zoot because they could only get 1 test in, and we were just trying to see if calf sleeves would work on them. So lots of data to go over here. Okay, so we're going to get right to it. Okay, so first, let's go over the 2 athletes who tested all 3. That would be Adam and Jake. Adam, who you're all very familiar with by now, he was the whole reason Zoot was even included in this test because his tri-team is sponsored by Zoot, and he just wanted to see how they stacked up against the other brands. But when he tested, it turned out they stacked up really well. And so Zoot ended up having to be included in this, even though they had provided me with a size run of calf sleeves. And that made me hesitant to use them because typically we like to purchase the products that we're testing because, quite frankly, we don't want any questions about integrity. So, but his test sort of made us use Zoot because when he tested Zoot, and he tested 3 times, they were pretty clearly faster for him. So the Zoot calf sleeves, which use very similar material to the Rule 28, but are built very differently from one another. Zoots are clearly longer than the Rule 28, and they have a band on the top, very similar, if not identical, to the band they use on their shorts, or on many of their shorts anyway. So when Adam tested the Zoots, he saw a 3.6% reduction in drag. That's pretty significant for calf sleeves. That's 8.6 watts for him at 240 watts. That's a big change, right? Whereas with Rule 28, he actually saw no change. There was no difference aerodynamically for him. And you had to wonder why. Like, they're very similar. How could they be so different? And we're going to go over that later because I think we made a mistake with the Rule 28s that could help them to be faster in the future. I could be wrong, but we'll find out. He also tested the Surface calf sleeves, and they were a 1.7% drop in drag for 4.1 watts. So less than half of what the Zoots were for him, which was pretty shocking. It was very shocking. So, but that is what it is. Let's move on to Jake. Jake, when he put the Rule 28 calf sleeves on, saw a 0.9% or 1.5 watt drop in drag. So a drop in drag for him with the Rule 28s. For Surface, he saw a 1.79% drop in drag. That for him is 3 watts at his 165 watt race pace. And then he puts the Zoots on and he sees a 2.69% drop in drag or 4.4 watts. So again, Zoot wins out over Surface and Rule 28. And that was the last athlete we used Rule 28 on. And it really just now became a test between Zoot and Surface because, again, those were the two that were kind of clearly standing out for us. Next, let's move on to Tony. Tony was an interesting one. We'll talk about him towards the end as well. But he put on the Zoots and saw a 0.99% drop in drag, so just about 1%, which was 2.7 watts reduction at his 270 watt race pace. So a reduction in drag right around that marginal gain area. With the Surface calf sleeves, it was a 0.74% drop in drag or 2 watts. So for both, they were a drop in drag. Here's the caveat for Tony, though. Tony did not have hairy legs. He did not have shaved legs. He had stubble. And my contention is stubble might be more aerodynamic than shaved. And we're going to find that out later this winter. But I found that fascinating for him because the Silka socks actually were a bigger reduction in drag for him. But at the time, he had shaved legs. So, kind of fascinating and something to look at later on when we do our mega leg shaving test, because I think stubble is faster. There you go. Next, let's move on to George. George saw the biggest reduction in drag by far from these. And again, there's a little caveat there, but when he put the Surface calf sleeves on, that was a 4.59% reduction in drag. Massive drop in drag. That was 11.5 watts. So there you go. Huge drop in drag for him. Well, then he put the Zoots on and he saw a 6.63% drop in drag, or 16.5 watts. This was at a 250 watt race pace. Now that 16.5 watts, I think was a little bit exaggerated. A week later, we retested, but we didn't retest the calf sleeves individually. They were combined with something else. But based on those numbers, I think a more realistic number for him is probably 13 watts drop in drag, maybe 14, but let's just say 13. But still a massive drop in drag. It was repeated, and they were faster than the Surface, which is just, again, such a surprise to us. We did have one athlete, however, who did test faster with the Surface, and that was Corey. Corey wasn't actually a part of this test. He's a client who tested with me, and it just so happened that he allowed us to use his data for this video. Corey, when he put on the Zoot calf sleeves, saw no change at all. They were completely aero neutral for him, no worse, no better. Whereas when he put the Surface calf sleeves on, that was a 1.8% drop in drag, or 5 watts. So for him, the Surface obviously worked better. And so there you go. So those are all the people we tested with both Zoot and Surface. 4 out of 5 were faster with the Zoots. We did not test any women in the Surface calf sleeves because no one fit the medium sleeves that we had. But let's go over what the women's results were. So first you have Annie. Annie saw a 1.88% drop in drag with the Zoot calf sleeves, and that was 3 watts at 160 watts. So faster for her. If you recall back, Annie was part of our Silka sock test, and the Silkas were actually a slight increase in drag for her. So she saw a reduction in drag from calf sleeves. Then you have Ida. Ida saw less than 0.5% reduction in drag, or less than 1 watt, 0.8 watts at 160 watt race pace. That's kind of a wash. I don't think you can really say that's a gain or a loss. I think that's kind of a well within margin of error, and so probably just aero neutral. And if you think back to the Silka sock test, she saw 1.44% reduction in drag from the Silka socks, which was 2.3 watts for her. So the socks worked better than the calf sleeves. And we tested those on the same day, by the way. So there you go. Lastly, you have Megan, who wore the Zoot calf sleeves and saw a 2.35% reduction in drag, or 4.2 watts at her 180 watt race pace. So virtually everyone saw some reduction in drag from using calf sleeves. And when I look back to athletes who haven't tested well with calf sleeves, they did tend to be women. But more importantly, they tended to be tested at the end of their AERO test session. It was almost like an afterthought, like, hey, let's throw on calf sleeves real quick and see how those do, because everything else had been tested. And looking back on that, I'd like to retest some of those athletes, because I think if you make the calf sleeves a priority before fatigue sets in, you may see different results. You may not, but I think it's possible, and I think it's important to go back and look at that, because fatigue is the AERO test killer when you're doing real world AERO testing. But for us, for our test riders, all but one saw a drop in drag from using calf sleeves. So I think, the obvious conclusion there is that calf sleeves do indeed work. Now let's go back to the Rule 28 real quick, because they didn't perform as well as the others, but I think there might be a reason for that. So if you look at this video of Jake here when he's putting them on, you see how they sort of get white as he slides them on? I wonder if we shouldn't have sized up on the Rule 28s. I wonder if, we tried to use the same size for everybody, and in Jake's case it was a medium, and I wonder if they got a little too stretched out in the ridges, which are trying to create a boundary layer trip, or they're trying to create turbulence. I wonder if they didn't flatten out a little bit from being too stretched, and if we had maybe used a large set of calf sleeves on him, they would have perhaps done better. So that's where I think it'll be interesting in the future to include Rule 28 and some more testing, but we'll size up for every athlete and see how they perform then. And it could be that they actually perform better once we do that. Okay, so this week's video is the first time we're going to actually do something new, and that's we are going to certify something as AERO. When a certain product or certain positional change or whatever ends up being AERO for the majority of athletes, we will certify that as AERO. And in this case, we're going to do, two products here, because clearly both the Surface and the Zoot worked on athletes and both should be certified as AERO. Yes, the Zoot did a little better. Your results may vary, but I think both are certainly worthy of being certified as AERO. We have a secondary certification for the Zoot because, hey, let's face it, they're the best bang for your buck in this area here, right? They're $50 versus the Surface, which are €150, I think right around $161, something like that, depending on what the exchange rate is. So, clearly, less than a third the price, and yet they perform better for our particular athletes. Doesn't mean they'll perform better for you, but they did for our athletes. So they also get the bang for your buck award here because they're just that much better. And Zoot is actually making their calf sleeves a bigger bang for your buck because they're actually providing a discount code, a 30% off discount code to any viewer of this video who wishes to buy their product. And now this is a discount code that existed previously to all clients who tested with AERO Sports, but Zoot was kind enough to extend it to any viewer of this video. So if you want to buy the Zoot calf sleeves, we have no benefit. There are no commissions to us whatsoever. It's just a discount for you. You can use the code listed below at checkout, and you will get 30% off that purchase. Okay, so there are the results from our calf sleeve test. Thank you so much for watching this. Please hit the like button if this was beneficial to you. Subscribe to the channel. It's just going to continue to encourage us to do more testing. Next week, we answer the question, how fast do you need to be going for aerodynamics to matter? And if you have a thought on that, please leave it in the comments below. How fast do you think someone needs to be going for aerodynamics to matter? That's next week. Until that time, don't be a drag, get AERO, and we'll see you next week.